In the rain-slicked, neon-drenched streets of Cypher-Provence, Philadelphia, the year 2050 offered little comfort to those haunted by the past. Steve Morrison, a brilliant 25-year-old engineer, found himself once again standing before the monolithic facade of the state governor's office, a place that had become a monument to his frustration. He was here, as he had been countless times before, to petition for access to the evidence from his mother's murder. A cold case, a ghost story from his infancy. She had been killed in New York when he was just a few months old, a tragedy that had shaped the entire trajectory of his life. The official records were sparse, the details blurred by time and bureaucracy. But one element stood out, a tantalizing and maddening anomaly that had obsessed him since childhood. A peculiar device found at the scene. It was an artifact that defied all classification, an object whose design conformed to no known technology of the time, powered by a source that remained a complete enigma to the world's leading scientists. This single piece of evidence was the anchor to his past, the key he believed could unlock the truth of her senseless death. This mysterious device was more than just a piece of evidence to Steve. It was the ghost in his machine, the central question that had driven his every ambition. The stories he'd been told about it throughout his life were the seeds from which his entire career had grown. He had pursued a rigorous education, earning degrees in engineering and advanced electrical theory from one of the nation's most prestigious universities. His academic journey was not for wealth or acclaim, but for a singular, deeply personal purpose: to one day possess the knowledge necessary to dissect, understand, and ultimately trace the origin of the alien artifact. He was convinced that if he could just solve the riddle of the device, he could finally answer the gnawing question of why. Why his mother? Why was she targeted? The device held the answer, and he had dedicated his life to being the one who could interpret its silent, metallic language. He envisioned himself in a sterile lab, poring over the object, its secrets slowly unfurling under his expert analysis, finally bringing peace to a wound that had never been allowed to heal. But the cold, unyielding wall of bureaucracy proved to be an even greater enigma than the device itself. His request, meticulously prepared and logically argued, was denied. Again. The official stamp delivered the rejection with an air of finality, the sound echoing the closing of a door in his face. Case closed. Sensitive materials. State property. The excuses were a rotating cast of familiar hollow phrases. It was becoming painfully clear that the system was not designed to provide answers, but to protect its own secrets. The frustration simmering within Steve began to boil over into a cold, hard resolve. If the lawful path was forever blocked, then he would have to forge his own. The thought, once a fleeting, desperate whisper in the back of his mind, now solidified into a concrete plan. The only way he would ever get his hands on that device, the only way he would ever find the truth, was to take it. The decision settled over him, heavy and irreversible. He would steal it. The following weeks were a blur of meticulous, obsessive planning. Steve channeled his engineer's mind, a mind trained to see systems and exploit their weaknesses, into the art of thievery. He mapped the governor's evidence vault, studied security patrol schedules, and analyzed blueprints of the building's ventilation and power grids. He used his expertise to design custom tools, small sophisticated gadgets to bypass electronic locks and disable sensors. Every detail was calculated, every contingency considered. He felt a strange sense of calm in the process, the intricate logic of the heist, a welcome distraction from the chaotic emotions swirling beneath. The night of the robbery arrived, cloaked in a storm that lashed against the city's glass towers. He moved like a phantom through the darkened corridors, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He bypassed the security systems with a grace and precision that would have made his professors proud. Finally, he stood before the vault. The final lock clicked open. Inside, resting on a velvet pedestal under a single beam of light, was the device. It was smaller than he'd imagined, a complex lattice of unfamiliar metals and glowing filaments. As his fingers brushed against its cool surface, A surge of triumph and anticipation coursed through him. He had done it. But in that moment of victory, something went terribly, catastrophically wrong. Perhaps it was a fail-safe he hadn't anticipated, or perhaps the device was simply not meant to be disturbed. As he lifted it from its pedestal, the filaments within it began to pulse with an angry, incandescent energy. The low hum it emitted escalated into a deafening shriek that tore through the silence of the vault. A wave of force threw him back against the wall, the air crackling with ozone and an energy he had never conceived of. The device, now floating in midair, became a miniature sun, its light growing in intensity until it was an all-consuming, blinding whiteness. The light consumed everything. It was not just a visual sensation, but a physical one, a pressure that seemed to unmake reality itself. Steve felt as though he were being torn apart and reassembled, atom by atom. The roar in his ears dissolved into a profound, terrifying silence. Time and space warped around him, stretching and compressing in an impossible, nauseating dance. The world dissolved into a smear of pure white agony. The next thing he knew, he was on a hard floor, his head pounding, his vision swimming. The blinding light was gone, replaced by the dim, unfamiliar glow of a single table lamp. Before he could even process where he was, a figure lunged at him from the shadows. A young woman, her face a mask of terror and rage. She screamed, attacking him with a desperate fury, her fists flailing against his chest. Disoriented and still reeling from the temporal whiplash, Steve acted on pure instinct. He raised his hands to defend himself, shouting for her to stop, to calm down. In the chaotic struggle, he pushed back, trying to create space to understand what was happening. It wasn't a hard shove, but it was enough. The woman stumbled backward, her feet tangling. Her head struck the sharp corner of a wooden coffee table. With a sickening crack, she collapsed to the floor and lay still. The sudden, brutal silence was deafening. Steve scrambled to her side, his mind a maelstrom of confusion and panic. He checked her pulse, his trembling fingers pressing against her neck. Nothing. A cold dread, colder than the New York winter he'd only read about, seeped into his bones. She was dead. He had killed her. And then a new sound pierced the horrifying quiet. The wail of a baby, crying from a nearby room. The sound was small, fragile, yet it hit him with the force of a physical blow. Still bewildered, his gaze flickered between the crying, the still form of the woman on the floor, and the unfamiliar apartment around him. A sinking, impossible feeling began to crawl up his spine. He needed to know who she was. His hands shaking uncontrollably, he searched for her purse. He found a wallet, and inside, a driver's license. He stared at the photograph, his eyes widened, and all the color drained from his face, leaving it a pale, horrified mask. The name on the ID, the face in the picture, it was his mother. He had somehow been thrown back in time 25 years into the past, and the baby, whose cries now sounded like an accusation, could only be him. In that single, soul-shattering moment, the fragmented stories of his past coalesced into a complete, horrifying picture. He remembered what the old case file said, what his relatives had whispered about. The man who killed his mother was never formally identified, but was cornered and killed by police in a shootout weeks later, in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. He now knew the killer's identity. It was him, his own future self. He knew how his story was supposed to end, how his own existence was predicated on this very moment, and the grim fate that awaited him. His fate was already written, a closed loop. He was now trapped inside, yet a desperate, defiant spark ignited within him. He had to try. He would try to change it. He would run, hide, do anything to escape the destiny that had been laid out for him. But as he fled into the night, every choice he made, every turn he took seemed to guide him inexorably toward that preordained warehouse. The events unfolded just as they had been told to him. A script he was forced to act out, culminating in the flashing lights and the final fatal volley of gunfire. The question hangs in the silence of paradox and echoes across time. If Steve Morrison hadn't been consumed by the need to solve his mother's murder, if he hadn't stolen that device from the future, would she have lived? Or was he merely a pawn in a game he couldn't comprehend? His life an inescapable causal loop, with no beginning and no end. Was it a tragedy of his own making, or was he simply the victim of a strange, cruel twist of fate?